Hello. Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Yeah, welcome to this colloquium on mimetic theory and political theology, ways to overcome polarization. All of you who are present here in Boston College campus and those who are following this session on Zoom and Facebook Live. It is not possible to speak of political theology today without mentioning the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which is a dramatic expression of the ground zero of civilizational collapse within our time. From that land of rubble, Mitri Raheb, a Palestinian Christian theologian, writes, I quote him, "This is the contemporary context of the land of Palestine. Biblical history is used as a prop for a colonial settlement project." End of quotation. From the rubble of yesterday and today's wars, as symbolized by the ancestral narrative of a founding sacrifice, a cry arises from humanity. For as long as we can remember, the blood of Abel rises to heaven. And according to the biblical narrative, it is precisely there that God reveals himself, listening to the cry of the innocent and paradoxically preserving the life of the fratricida, Cain, and those opening the time of messianic expectation. The social and religious polarization that we see today all over the world has entered into what Girard called la montée aux extrêmes, the escalation to extremes, where the unveiling of Satan's lie and the revelation of the Messiah's truth take place at the same time. This apocalyptic reason, argued by the thinker from Avignon, is not a call to mere resignation in the face of the evil in progress, but on the contrary, the remedy, pharmakon, for the transforming action that arises from the intelligence of the victim. A wisdom that James Allison reminds us in the way to participate in the dynamism of the victim's life. This colloquium is part of a trilogy of conversations, or seedbeds, conversatorios in Spanish, where we seek to sow seeds for a decolonial, mimetic, and apophatic political theology. The hope is to propose the coordinates for a fundamental or philosophical theology on the possibility of living together in common. That's politics, or the political. The first colloquium was held here at BC last September with the intelligent and provocative word of Professor Nelson Maldonado Torres, a Puerto Rican decolonial thinker, who helped us to think of the decolonial approach as a process of dismantling structures of political, epistemological, and ontological domination through a combative and anti-systemic decoloniality. In this second colloquium, we will address the mimetic perspective. So to explore the anthropological mechanism of mimetic desire, that is the internal path of violence and of redemption, which must be resolved in its sacrificial mechanism, so to make possible the overcoming of rivalry, sacrifice, and resentment. And finally, next April, we will explore the apophatic horizon of political theology and philosophy with the collaboration of Professor Matthew Vail and Matt Kruger. A necessary endeavor in these times which are marked by the denial of otherness. We will count on the wisdom of three colleagues, Jim Heisig, John Moleri, and Amador Vega, who for decades have explored the paths of the negativity of being, from medieval to modern times, both in Christian and Buddhist apophatic mysticism and the philosophical thought of Dasein. But let us begin today with the first panel, Spirituality and Forgiveness, which was coordinated by the colleague Brian Robinette. And for now, I give the floor to the moderator of the panel, Francis Boccuzzi, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everyone. So today's panel will be on spirituality and forgiveness. Each panelist, Robinette, Maddie, Jarrett, and then Greg Mileski will give about 20 minutes roundtable discussion. And then James Allison will give a little bit of his own insights, and then it'll be open to kind of discussion for the rest of the time. So first, Brian will present. We'll give him a brief introduction, even though he doesn't need one, but I insist. So Brian D. Robinette is Associate Professor of Theology at Boston College. After receiving his PhD from the University of Notre Dame in 2003, he taught at St. Louis University for 9 years before moving to Boston. He researches and teaches in the areas of systematic, philosophical, and spiritual theology, with special interest in theology of creation, doctrine of God, and contemplative practice. His first book, Grammars of Resurrection, A Christian Theology of Presence and Absence, received awards from the Catholic Press Association and the College Theology Society. His second book, The Difference Nothing Makes, Creation, Christ, and Contemplation, was published in 2024 by the University of Notre Dame Press. Please welcome Brian Robinette.
Thank you, Francis. And thank you, Carlos, especially. I've learned a lot from you through this process. You should see what Carlos is capable of doing in facilitating conversation and, of course, contributing to it as well. Having organized this and thought so creatively about putting this together and the various themes, it's been very impressive to me, and it has been instructive to me and to others. So thank you for that. Of course, thanks to James Allison for being here. It was a privilege to be able to introduce you for the lecture on Wednesday, and it was wonderful to see the packed house and the responses to that afterwards. And so the generosity of your time being here and responding to what it is that you're hearing is also a really wonderful model to us. So thank you. And of course, thank you to my co-panelists, Greg Mileski and Maddie Jarrett. The particular theme of this workshop, this part of the workshop, spirituality and forgiveness, or spirituality of forgiveness, was imagined as a good start and sort of a ramping up to some other themes. But as we had been discussing by way of ongoing workshopping over the past several weeks, this seemed to us, I think, together to be a fitting way to bring some of the recurrent themes and questions that were arising. And so it's hoped that the papers that we have together will have some appropriate convergences, but sufficient divergences to allow for dynamic conversation to come. My comments will probably last around 23 or 4 minutes or so, I would say. So the title of my talk is Let This Mind Be in You, Mimetic Theory and Spirituality of Forgiveness, or Spirituality and Forgiveness. The scriptural passage that titles my talk today will be familiar to you, as it appears just before the celebrated Christ hymn of Philippians 2. Paul exhorts his readers to let the mind of Christ be in them. Christ, the one who, though in the form of God, did not grasp at God as something to be possessed, but rather emptied himself, becoming human, like us, obedient to death, even death on a cross. The theme of Christ's kenosis, or self-emptying, has given rise to much theological reflection over the centuries, including speculation over the ways we might speak of divine self-emptying in God's creative and redemptive act. Paul's reference to the mind of Christ has been no less subject to speculation, as perhaps it suggests a kind of Christ mysticism associated with heightened states of consciousness or a unique capacity for spiritual perception. While I think the latter interpretation is off base, I don't wish to speak of either theme, Christ's kenosis or the mind of Christ, in a speculative register. For once we discover that Paul's reference to mind is in the Greek really to have understanding, we recognize that it doesn't refer to a special organ of spiritual intelligence, but rather something like a mindset or an encompassing vision. To borrow a phrase from Charles Taylor, it suggests a background imaginary, a tacit horizon of meaning and value that guides a way of living. Such knowing is a matter of phronesis, a lived wisdom or practical intelligence. It has less to do with a knowing what than a knowing how. Now, I don't wish to deny a proper role for speculative knowing, and I think too much can be made by those who would oppose practical and theoretical knowing, as though the former were the real world and the latter all in the head, or worse. But in the context of the Philippians hymn, we should take Paul's cue to insist on the lived wisdom that is the mind of Christ. Such wisdom is not something any individual possesses, since a few verses earlier, he urges the Philippians to be of one mind, or like-minded, by loving one another and sharing the same vision. The mind of Christ is a shared intelligence and a shared way of life. We can also be sure that having the mind of Christ is not like adding new bits of information to a prior framework. Rather, Paul means to shift the very framework of knowing itself, a shift so significant as to entail an epistemic landslide. The mind of Christ for Paul is a happening, a great reversal that would enfold us should we consent to it. To let this mind be in us is to allow it. The mind of Christ is not, therefore, something we acquire or make happen any more than we endow ourselves with existence. To be sure, we are collaborators in the mind of Christ, and thus our agency is fully enlisted through a host of practices that rehearse or enact it in various circumstances over time. But the emphasis is placed here on letting the mind of Christ be in you. And this cannot be incidental to the theme of kenosis communicated by the hymn. For just as Christ did not grasp at God as something to be possessed, so too do we share in the mind of Christ by not grasping and not reifying the other. The mind of Christ is something we let be in us. It is not so much attained as allowed. So what kind of lived wisdom is this? And what might it have to do with the spirituality of forgiveness, the theme of this session? I will return specifically to the issue of forgiveness later, though I would like to anticipate that discussion by pointing out that forgiveness precisely means being released or being set free from a weight or burden or stain. In other words, forgiveness is a kenotic act, one whose character is to let go and let be before all else. But to arrive at a better understanding of this, I'd like to invoke a key motif from James Allison's work, namely the intelligence of the victim. Along with James, and we've all agreed that it would be okay to call you James. I hope that's okay. We could say something Allison if you prefer. Okay. Along with James, I wish to suggest that the practical wisdom enshrined by the mind of Christ is not explicable within a worldly horizon. It is not of this world, if by the world we mean the social other. It is rather rooted in Christ's filiation with the Father. The mind of Christ refers to a dynamic relation, not a static property. And remarkably, it is this relation we are invited to share in and with each other. To explain this further, I think it useful to knock down a few initial objections to James' phrasing. I say this having taught his work over the years in a variety of circumstances. Sometimes the reaction to the phrasing is immediate and visceral, as though the intelligence of the victim romanticizes victims and encourages identification with victimhood. At other times, this reaction takes the form of worry that Jesus' death on the cross will assume so central a role that his life ministry gets eclipsed, as though everything important about the kingdom of God were merely a prelude to the cross. A very different reaction takes the form of concern over the word intelligence, as though it were principally a matter of theoretical knowledge or secret gnosis, to which only a select few have access. Incidentally, this is not unrelated to a criticism that some have made of Girard's theory in general, namely, that by having an explanatory account of all manner of phenomena, including the origins of culture and the hidden dynamics of human desire, one may be in possession of salvific gnosis. Isn't it special to the point of elitism to have knowledge of so much that is hidden from everybody else? Regarding the first objection, nothing in James or Girard's work can be said to romanticize victimhood, as this would amount to the very sacralization process that is characteristic of scapegoating itself. To accord a special status to victims precisely because of victimization is just another, if obverse, form of exclusionary identity formation. By romanticizing the status of the victim and by laying claim to victimhood, either for ourselves or on behalf of others, we can be assured of our righteousness and leverage our victim power for some kind of social utility. This, of course, is exactly what Nietzsche accused Judaism and Christianity of amounting to, religions of ressentiment that aim to take secret revenge on oppressors by valorizing the status of the weak. But again, this is exactly what the intelligence of the victim does not imply. Instead, the intelligence of the victim is an intelligence that is not run by resentment or vengeance whatsoever. It is not moved reactively by what the social other is doing, as James puts it, but is imitative of the Father, whose freedom and love is ever for the other while not being over and against the other. Regarding the second objection, the intelligence of the victim does not refer to a single moment, say the cross, in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but suffuses the whole arc of it. The entire manner of Jesus' kingdom of God ministry, for example, exhibits the intelligence of the victim by working nonviolently to disrupt all manner of in-group, out-group polarization. Consider just the following. Jesus' frequent table fellowship with sinners, tax collectors, and a host of others considered beyond the pale. His breaking of purity laws in order to show that the Sabbath was made for human flourishing, not burdensome precepts. His insistence that purity is a matter of the heart's intention, not outward ritual performance, heredity, or office. His healing and touching of those who, on account of physical infirmities, were unable to participate fully in common worship. His forgiveness of sins, which, among other things, short-circuited the crucial mediating function of the temple and its administrative class. His admonishment of the disciples for their rivalrous position. His public association with women. His intervention into the stoning of a woman caught in adultery, thus subverting the scapegoat mechanism hidden within it, or not so hidden. His portrayal of the reviled outsider, the Samaritan who extended God's mercy to a victim when a priest and Levite refused. His welcoming of children and the little ones to whom the kingdom belongs. His announcement of beatitude for the poor, the meek, and the persecuted. His call to forgive debts. His trenchant criticisms of wealth and the hoarding of possessions. His portrayal of the Father's compassion galloping out to embrace the prodigal son who had finally come home, etc. I rattle off these features of Jesus' ministry in rapid succession because each of them in their own way and in their tapestry-like sum flesh out the intelligence of the victim and give it dynamic content. This is what the mind of Christ looks and sounds and acts like. And through such embodied and discursive acts, we sense a living wisdom that, while creatively intervening in a host of insider-outsider divisions, is not merely reacting to them, nor setting up a new, now superlative insider group at the expense of some other. It is this free and loving disposal towards others without being run by others that is characteristic of Jesus' entire ministry. Regarding the third objection, it should already be clear that James's use of intelligence in no way implies a distinctive faculty or secret information possessed by an elite few. Intelligence here implies an embodied way of life that is creatively adapted to shifting circumstances and concrete persons. It is a practical intelligence that is at work here, though this is not exclusive of other kinds of knowing, including speculative. Moreover, the intelligence on display here is not meant to persuade others by adducing reasons or textual proofs, even though Jesus is regularly presented as an incisive teacher. Persuasion comes principally by the way of desire. As Gerhard Lofink notes in his Jesus of Nazareth, variations of the verb to follow appear more than 80 times in the Gospels. The discipleship portrayed in them implies much more than the rabbinical formulation common at the time. And here I quote Lofink. He writes, being his disciples meant following him into always changing situations. But within this constant change, accompanied by its eschatological pressure, there took place a daily exercise, a daily inculcation of the new community of discipleship, involving, for example, the rule that the disciples had to forgive one another 77 times a day. That is, constantly, end quote. It's from Matthew 18, 21, 22. Imitation, therefore, proves fundamental to the content of Jesus' ministry. He was modeling a way of life for others to follow, a pattern of desire, an imaginative horizon, an attitudinal and behavioral orientation. I wish to make 3 observations in response to Lofink's discussion of discipleship. The first is that the intelligence of the victim, as applied to the life of discipleship portrayed in the Gospels, is taught by being caught. Following Jesus has little to do with assimilating information within a prior framework. It has to do with desiring in the way Jesus desires. Discipleship amounts to the slow, if sometimes painful and confusing shift in the whole field of knowing, the tacit background or imaginary out of which we are formed. Mimetic desire, which is far deeper than mimicry, proves fundamental to the content of Jesus' ministry. He opens the kingdom of God for others, not through the presentation of principles and ideas, but by a showing how, by offering a way of desire as our induction into God's reign. My second observation follows from Lofink's reference to the practice of forgiveness as a condition for discipleship. Forgiveness is not characterized here as an occasional practice. The reference to 77 times a day is meant in its hyperbolic way to say constantly. So whereas we tend to think of forgiveness in terms of a response to a transgression or harm, a specific circumstance or encounter that elicits a reaction or a response, whether forgiving or not, the implication of this passage from Matthew 18 is that forgiveness has more deeply to do with a way of life, habitus, an abiding attitude, a way of desire that manifests variously in concrete circumstances as they arise. As Lofink notes, the call to forgive one another again and again and again is of a piece with many other of Jesus's calls. To not look for the splinter in another's eye, to serve one another and not seek special praise, to live without anxiety over the morrow, to renounce any kind of use of force in a spirit of radical nonviolence, to celebrate the kingdom as the coming of a feast, and so on. In other words, there is not one special practice of forgiveness and another practice of serving in another, and yet another practice of nonviolence, still another of joy. Rather, all these practices share in the one practice of discipleship, which is desiring according to Jesus's desire. There may be occasions to differentiate them at some level, but we will miss out on their distinctive characteristics if we do not only see them, if we do not see them as united in one practice. But then what does it mean to say desiring according to Jesus's desire? This brings me to my third and final observation today. And here we return to the intelligence of the victim. What is the ultimate source of this intelligence? Where does it come from? What is its wellspring? It is nothing less than Christ's filial relation with the Father and the non-possessive, non-reifying way of life that this relation opens up for us. As James puts it in The Joy of Being Wrong, quote, "The disciples' understanding was, as ours is, formed by what Jesus was trying to change. That is, the constitution of our consciousness in rivalry and the techniques of survival by exclusion of the other," end quote. Jesus' entire ministry, no less than the effects of his resurrection from the dead, was intent upon reversing these techniques and freeing us from building identities over against one another. This reversal is not, in the first place, possible by dint of cleverness and will. Rather, it is made possible by openness to the unconditioned source and ground of our very being, in whom there is no rivalry or possessiveness at all. Because Jesus lives in total transparency to the Father, Jesus is the one who lives utterly free from rivalry with the human other. Since Jesus perfectly imitates God the Father, whose reality is sheer gratuity, unmoved by reciprocity as agape love, this is the true significance of divine impassibility in my view. Jesus can live among his sisters and brothers with freedom for them without any tenacious grip on his own identity. Jesus' identity, his filial suchness, is not built upon contrasting relations with others, but only kenotic openness towards others. This is not self-abasement in any way. It is just the recognition that any, quote, self arising by way of contrasting relations with the other, whether human or divine, is not really a self at all, but a tenuous construction that exists to the extent that it grasps. So when Paul speaks of having the mind of Christ, he is speaking of just this non-grasping intelligence, a lived wisdom that is not a matter of acquisition, but of deepest allowance. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself. The mind of Christ is freed from rivalry with God, translucent to the divine other, one whose pacific otherness, and I love the phrase, James uses it often, and I do too, pacific otherness or pacific reality of God. That is what facilitates our becoming persons. This is the spirituality of forgiveness, I submit. Not because there is a distinctive spirituality to forgiveness per se, but because the very possibility of our forgiving one another, of releasing one another from resentments and conflictual entanglements, is rooted in something prior to anything or anyone occasioning the contingent need for forgiveness, namely the unconditioned generosity of God. Our practice of forgiving one another is therefore not just one kind of thing Christians are called to do. It is part of a suite of practices, and indeed a way of life, which has as its source the opening of our very consciousness and will to the pacific reality of God. This is the practice, one might say, this letting be and ever deepening receptivity to divine life. Final paragraph. Of course, I recognize at once that saying this does not answer the many questions that arise about forgiveness, including the 15 questions in Steve Pope's head right now. The concrete conditions and processes for reconciliation between persons and groups, I am not saying thereby that no discernment is necessary for sorting out problematic understandings of forgiveness from legitimate understandings, cheap grace from authentic grace. And I haven't said the first word about the recognition and confession of guilt, or how the long-term working out of grievances and calls for justice are subverted by superficial or forced demands for forgiveness. Such issues, I suspect, will be forthcoming in our discussion. But to frame that discussion, I think it crucial to see, as the Gospels would have us see, that the variety of dispositions and practices to which the disciples of Christ are called have as their beating heart a way of desiring that is rooted in our filial relation with God, which is a sharing in, by grace, Christ's own filiation with the Father. To be a disciple is to let the mind of Christ be in us, and this mind, this intelligence, may manifest in and through us to the extent we allow it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Robinette. Our next speaker is Jarrett. So Jarrett is a PhD student in systematic theology at Boston College. Her research engages issues of theological anthropology, particularly as they relate to embodied experiences of grace and limitation. She's also interested in temporality, disability, agency, joy, and the theology of call runner. Let's please welcome Jarrett.
Okay, can you hear me all right? I want to begin my presentation by noting that my interest in Gerard began in a seminar that was co-taught by Dr. Robinette and Dr. Wilkins. Lonergan was also there. And so immediately in that course, I found mimetic theory as mediated in the work of both René Girard and James Allison highly convincing. It opened up a world of questions for me, and a lot of them I considered exploring today. I thought about discussing the poignancy of this theory for explaining disability scapegoating, exclusion, and its relationship to the denial of death. Or maybe I could have engaged with feminist critiques of mimetic theory. Although I find mimetic theory highly convincing, it remains a serious challenge to the field that so few women are engaged, interested, or included in these conversations. But as we prepared for this colloquium throughout the past couple of months, the question that has haunted me most, or that haunted me most in the seminar, made its way back into the forefront of my thought. First, though, at the risk of being simplistic, I want to give some background for those who may be unfamiliar with mimetic theory. Mimetic conceptions of anthropology reveal two patterns of desire, both of which inform and impact the conception of identity. In the first pattern, identity is received from the social other amidst mimetic reciprocity and rivalry. The self is constituted here entirely by others. Desire is lived out in rivalry, and identity is grounded in grasping and defining oneself over and against the social other. In the second pattern of desire, identity is grounded in God. Mimetic desire is directed towards Christ's specific model of pacific mimesis. Here, identity is first and foremost grounded in a capital O other. The embrace of pacific mimesis is very closely linked to the practice of authentic forgiveness. It is important to note that this way of modeling Christ has sometimes been conceptualized with language of self-sacrifice or self-denial. However, given the harmful ways in which self-sacrifice has been used to denigrate and disempower oppressed groups throughout Christian history, this concept must be qualified and protected against. As Dr. Robinette highlighted, it is not self-abasement. Here, self-sacrifice might be framed as overcoming the allure of devaluation of the other. In order to be effective, righteous claims for justice must exist entirely separately from any mimetic devaluation of the enemy oppressor. Unbalanced emphasis on a narrow conception of self-sacrifice can have a negative, even dangerous consequence for traditionally marginalized groups whose agency has been disempowered by oppressive social structures in the service of dominant more powerful groups. Here I'm thinking specifically of people for whom a consistent, steady drip of oppressive waters has worn down their sense of inherent belovedness, their sense of being always held in love by God, which seems to be foundational to the ability to ground oneself in pacific mimesis. So this is a situation that generates my haunting question, which is really multiple questions in true academic fashion. Given our tendency to form our identities in relation to the social other, how might we begin to reform our identities in the service of a new pacific mimesis, a new mimetic practice? More specifically, how might those who had their sense of goodness of self undermined by cultural biases and social structures reclaim or rebuild an identity grounded in pure belovedness by God? And what resources can we offer that might empower agents in the embrace of an identity that is constituted by God? So now we'll turn to some sources of agency. There are many that I could have, or that I thought about exploring here. Contemplative practice inspired by Dr. Robinette, or the formation of desire along the lines of Sarah Coakley, who ironically was a critic of mimetic anthropology, but I think that there's still something there. But I'm in the middle of my comprehensive exams reading, and I've recently come across a resource that I think may be another valuable resource for this task, and that is joy, which I see as closely related to a temporal imaginary grounded in the resurrection. Joy, I argue, can be a mediator of agency, and specifically the agency to embrace belovedness by God, and therefore a mediator of the ability to embrace pacific mimesis. In his lecture on Wednesday, James Allison proposed a pneumatological anthropology as that which is capable of resisting the mimetic pull of being riled up into the twin reactions of self-righteousness and shame. In the next few minutes, I will argue that the cultivation of joy might be considered a feature of this anthropology, and actually as a part of letting the mind of Christ be in us. So now let us define joy. First, what it is not. Metz emphasizes joy that is not merely natural optimism about existence, nor is it a desperate naivete. More than other virtues, we have to ensure that joy is not misused by reactionary interests and ideologies. For Metz, it must involve commitment to making the lives of others better. Crisp also highlights the dangers of an unbalanced account of joy. These are contentment with the status quo and the lack of questioning of harmful or social material conditions. For Metz, joy is about saying yes when we recognize that there's so much to say no to. Similarly, Moltmann identifies joy as an enduring attitude toward living. He asks us to consider Paul's invitation to rejoice always as a fundamental Christian call. Wolf and Crisp edited a collection of essays on joy, and they both noted that at the center of the essays is the conviction, I quote, the conviction that joy stands at the very core of Christian faith, life, and practice, end quote. And that the dearth of theological study of joy leaves us bereft of a key resource for articulating what Christianity is truly about. Jean-Luc Chrétien also offers some insights into joy from a phenomenological perspective. He identifies joy as dilation, or the expansion of the soul, the experience of an infused presence of God. For Chrétien, the dilation of joy, is the means by which we become more and more capable of God. Joy increases our capacity for welcoming and receptivity. For Chrétien, joy is not the negation of negativity that is sadness. Rather, joy that is given us something that is vaster than myself, vaster than ourselves. There's no need to hoard it, budget it, or treat it as exhaustible. Chrétien's insight suggests that the spiritual dilation affected by joy makes one more capable of receiving the presence of God, and thus an identity formed by God. Many scholars highlight also the relationship between joy and the resurrection. N.T. Wright notes the theological and eschatological nature of joy in Scripture. Wright notes that the reason for Paul's joy is not about leaving the world behind, but rather that the source of Paul's joy is the resurrection of Jesus, which has created a new world, and with it now, importantly, a new worldview. He writes, "The fact of the resurrection and exaltation of the crucified Jesus opens up a new world, launches the new creation, over which Jesus himself is sovereign. That is the root cause of joy." Emanuel Falk writes compellingly on the place of joy in the experience of resurrected subjectivity. In fact, he identifies joy as the very effective modality of the resurrection. He writes, "Joy is possible for us today. It is given by another to us, and it leads us to return to ourselves. True joy is thus what God's self, has placed in us, for which reason precisely it appears as perfect." And he quotes John 15:11. "I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete." Falk notes that this joy does not dissipate suffering. Amid the resurrected modality of life, suffering remains, as do the burdens of time. What is transformed by joy is our capacity to carry these burdens. The joy of the resurrection acknowledges that the experience of anxiety or anguish is not the last word. Seen through the prism of the resurrection, our true modality is not anxiety, but joy. Falk asks, "What is there then of this joy that I can find today? It is a joy that, when I renounce the idea of producing it myself, detaches me from my ego. It is a joy that demands that I give up the prospect of heroism in battle. And it is a joy that requires of me that I deconstruct in myself all pretension to constitute myself by myself." His insights here speak directly to the renouncement of the false egoism that perpetuates the cycle of mimetic rivalry and the recognition of interindividuality that grounds the embrace of pacific mimesis. Now it is important to explore a little bit more briefly, or a little bit more thoroughly, the relationship between joy, sorrow, and suffering. N.T. Wright asks, as I'm sure many of us here do, how can we speak of joy when so much is wrong in the world? In his research, Miroslav Volf has perceived ample joy operating in the midst of oppression. It seems to spring up, he notes, in more situations of adversity than it does in situations of plenty or comfort, which for Wolf breed indifference. Womanist scholars have affirmed a similar observation. Joy and resistance are very closely related. Willie Jennings writes, "In contexts where your energies have to be focused on survival, it does not leave a lot of energy for overt forms of complaint. You're spending a lot of time just trying to hold it together. The work of joy becomes serious work." He also notes that in the West, the work of joy is not the people's work. It's been brought to us, commercialized as part of an empire of advertisement. Capitalism does the work of presenting what's joyful and how to find joy. And there's a lot more to be said on this, which maybe I will at a later time. The insights of Wright, Falk, Wolf, and Jennings suggest that joy is not contrary to sorrow, but rather that joy recognizes the promise of life that reaches its arms beneath all sorrows, fear, and suffering. And I might add, in light of James Allison's lecture, shame, holding them and honoring them while tenderly situating them in the ultimate victory of God. In light of this, I suggest that joy can be an often overlooked source of agency for communities impacted by things like political violence. Metz notes that the mysticism of Christian joy often takes the form of passion, anger, and opposition to oppression. In service of this, he notes that we need reports and accounts of real experiences of joy to truly understand the concrete forms that this may take. So let us turn briefly to the work of Jana Hunter Bowman, whose book, Witnessing Peace, Becoming Agents Under Duress in Colombia, presents a theological and ethnographic account of the ecclesial communities of Northwest Colombia. She describes a trenchant example of joy's concrete form. She tells the story of Isaac, a young member of a local church community who is actively being pursued by the paramilitary for a targeted assassination. The soldiers believe that Isaac crossed into guerrilla territory while selling t-shirts to supplement his family's income. They accused him of espionage, a charge the community vehemently rejected. Upon being informed of the plot by one of Isaac's friends, church leaders contacted authorities. The army, complicit in the violence of the paramilitary, would not be able to arrive until late the next day. As more ultimately ineffective calls were being placed to international organizations and government contacts, paramilitary soldiers arrived, searching for Isaac in his home and various locations around town. Moments before, after being informed of the assassination plot, Isaac and his community had gathered in the church. Physically surrounding Isaac, they kept vigil over him, offering prayers and their bodies for protection. The community remained with Isaac through the night and into the morning, fully aware that they were risking their own deaths in doing so. Heavy paramilitary presence remained the next day, as did the members of the church. Eventually, the members of the church were able to accompany Isaac out of the town and into the mountains. Hunter Bowman notes that these high-risk interventions were common in the church communities of Northwest Colombia. They contributed to a culture of community-based, high-risk practices of nonviolent de-escalation. The dynamics of conflict slowly changed in the direction of social progress. And these groups were called on at local, regional, and national levels to help implement peace agreements. The actions by the community for Isaac's protection embody a subjectivity grounded in the inbreaking power of the Spirit. Hunter Bowman writes powerfully about the way in which this community was able to hold risk, joy, and agency together in their actions. I quote, "In a land saturated by the blood of 6 generations, in a land of people made absent, triumph lies in finding ways to protect, extend, and rehabilitate, resurrect life amid death. Risk, sacrifice, and pain are woven throughout. The seams of joy amid risk, and joy amid sacrifice, and even joy amid pain of other regarding love must not be eclipsed by defaulting to the paradigm of the cross or martyrdom. Must not be eclipsed. By defaulting to the paradigm of the cross or martyrdom, we miss important nuances of their capacity for action." Her comments here draw attention to the ways that this community embodied nonviolent political action. In the face of the grave failure of social institutions, they did not resign themselves to despair or cynicism. Rather, grounded in the power of the Spirit and fully aware of the uncertain outcome of their action, they chose to express their communal love. Joy in this community operated as a source of strength, agency, and the resistance of violence. Hunter Bowman notes that often stories like these are inscribed with the paradigm of the cross. This inscription, however, overlooks the power of resurrected subjectivity as embodied by joy, agency, interdependence, and action for justice that blooms even amidst the horrors of their suffering. Here, and in the insights of the aforementioned scholars, we can recognize the promise of resurrection as the ultimate affirmation of belovedness, and thus the ultimate source of both joy and the agency to claim belovedness in the service of the embrace of pacific mimesis. At its core, the resurrection, the ultimate source of our joy, offers us an image of living in the present that imbues agents with the power to continue proclaiming life and justice amidst death-dealing forces. So to conclude, I invite us to consider joy as an enduring attitude toward living, grounded in belovedness and the promise of life. And in light of this, Joy can be recognized as a part of the network of resources that empowers us to resist the mimetic pull of being riled up into the twin reactions of self-righteousness and shame, and empowers us to embrace the belovedness that is the ground of Pacific mimesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie, for such a joyful presentation. So fun and so fun. Our next and final presenter is Greg Mileski. He is a doctoral candidate and teacher in the Boston College Theology Department, where he studies issues within the Buddhist-Christian dialogue. His academic work has appeared in Dialogue and the Journal of Interreligious Studies, as well as elsewhere. He is ordained in the Lutheran tradition and enjoys preaching with a Buddhist accent. And he's a contributor to the upcoming poetry anthology, Thin Places and Sacred Spaces, from Amethyst Press. He is also managing editor for Religion and the Arts. Let's please welcome Greg Mileski.
Thank you, Francis, Brian, and Maddie. Thank you, James, and friends. If the work of René Girard revealed the dynamics of mimetic desire, the ways in which people, quote unquote, desire according to the other, phrase we've all used probably in papers, and so are socialized into relationships of rivalry, and the ways in which Christ represents the shattering of méconnaissance that had so long blinded us to the false sacred, and the writings of James Allison represent a narration of this process, a testament to the experiences themselves. If Professor Girard taught us what we needed to know, teaching us how the Gospels bring to light what had been hidden since the foundation of the world, as he put it, quoting the Gospel, then Brother James puts us in the upper room among the disciples, eyes opening for the first time. His work interrogates the experience the disciples underwent, asking how the risen and returned scapegoat Christ inducted the disciples into a new mode of being, one in which had been possible only for Christ himself, but is now the definitive and enlivening experience of the Christian. In doing so, James is implicitly and explicitly developing and describing a process of taking Jesus as a positive mimetic model. James's understanding of theology begins where Christianity begins, the upper room, into which the resurrected Christ burst, not with an angry need for vengeance, as those formed in the ways of violent reciprocity expected, but with a peaceful serenity. Quote, his presence to them was a forgiving presence, he writes. It was forgiveness as a person, unquote. In this moment, the disciples are not merely surprised, their expectations upended, but rather they are, in a sense, remade, their capacities to see and know God, themselves, and others recalibrated. The scapegoat returned, revealed to them the ways in which their previous lives had been ruled by death, the ways in which their fear of death had manifested in victim-making processes. Standing before them, speaking words of peace, the risen Christ revealed to them the non-ultimacy of death and a divine forgiveness for having acted from a mistaken notion of it. From this experience, inaugurated into what James will sometime later name the intelligence of the victim, the disciples begin that new community, who James names as those now, quote, being enabled to live as if death were not, end quote. Freed from the need to create identities and communities based on victimage, freed to live in imitation of the non-rivalistic pacific Christ, the disciples begin that body who is seeing through the false dichotomies of sinner opposed to non-sinner, of righteous opposed to unrighteous. And this is the body into which we Christians are being inducted. Through what James calls, quote, concrete, practical acts of relearning, which will at first strain against our old attitudinal patterns, quote, we aspiring imitators have our own relational patterns slowly remade. Among those concrete acts, James names baptism and Eucharist, but especially that of atonement, of forgiveness, as key to inducting the Christian into ever-increasing Christ-like patterns. This experience of undergoing atonement keeps the Christian community mindful of our shared complicity in victim-making and our remaining tendency toward relationships of rivalry. What this looks like, James writes in his atonement triptych in On Being Liked, quote, is coming to see oneself as part of the unrepentant, hard-hearted block that is in need of forgiveness, and starting to imagine oneself as in the process of being forgiven, end quote. Coming to see ourselves in this way enables us to encounter others not yet undergoing this experience differently than we would otherwise. We are always in need of forgiveness, as are all of them, whomever we would name as them. Rather than seeing these others, as those from whom I am now different, James tells us that, quote, forgiveness turns out to be a creative moving towards someone whom I am like, in such a way that they will be free from death with me, so that together we will be a new we, end quote. This means that when we meet those still enraptured with the victim-making processes, those still living from a fear of death, such that they are knowingly and unknowingly making victims by participating in and perpetuating systems of inequality and hierarchy, we are able to encounter them not as capital O others, but as those undergoing what we were undergoing, and not yet having undergone what we are undergoing. To join in those first disciples, and so many since, in imitating Christ, is to recognize our own place as forgiven sinner, so that we encounter those others in need of forgiveness gracefully, as those who are like us. Being encountered by Christ in atonement is to be called out of our habits of victim-making and othering, but in such a way that we do not then make victims of those others who have not yet begun to follow this call. This is fundamentally an act of compassion for others. Now, compassion can take several forms. It can appear as empathy and sympathy, understanding, as trying to see from the other's perspective. And it can also take the form of confrontation and of criticisms and rebukes carefully crafted. We are, in other words, trying to interrupt victim-making processes without participating in them. If for James, forgiveness is, quote, an ongoing process again and again of learning to behave as if death were not, end quote, then it is also, quote, coming gradually to stand up against those whose being depends on death and running the risk of being persecuted by them and maybe even killed by them, end quote. This, and I suspect this will not be a controversial point, is hard. It is hard because we are still surrounded by the world that is run by death, by the victim-making processes of rivalistic mimesis. We are still surrounded by them, and to extents we lament, we are still run by them. Those ways are around us and within us. The old Adam dies hard. We need that upper room experience again and again. We need Christ to come among us and repeat those words, peace be with you, again and again. We need to be shown over and over that we can trust God's revelation, that we really can behave as if death were not, even when that leads to death. That death we still know well how to fear. While this work of imitating Christ has contours that are particular to Christianity, it may be aided by recent research into what Paul Condon and John McCransky term sustainable compassion training. Activists and caregivers of all stripes often struggle to summon the compassionate care of their best intentions, sometimes succumbing to burnout and severely reducing or even abandoning their efforts. Condon and McCransky identify, quote, several inner psychological obstacles that limit people's ability to experience and cultivate compassion, including the lack of secure attachment, aversion to suffering, a sense of feeling alone in suffering, and reductive perceptions of self and others, end quote. While all of these have implications for the successful imitation of Christ, it is perhaps the lack of secure attachment that is most pernicious, as it has ramifications for all the others. Attachment theory suggests that one's ability to carry out caring compassion for others is rooted in one's own experiences of receiving such care. Building a secure attachment base begins even in infancy, when moments of distress and anxiety are met with responsive care. A secure attachment base begins to form. Those who experience themselves then as worthy of care begin to build a secure attachment base and are more likely to later express a host of healthy interpersonal skills later in life, including the ability to offer compassionate care for others, even when doing so carries personal risk. Getting up in the middle of the night, Francis, has a lot more riding on it than you might have thought. Well, it's going to empower you in a moment. Those who have not built such a base are, quote, less likely to engage in costly helping behaviors for others, end quote. Any person can have their insecurities triggered at any time, and so become less likely to show care and compassion as a result. But those with a secure attachment base become most resilient to insecurity triggers, and so most likely to engage in such acts, even costly ones. A secure attachment base becomes a potent resource for encountering distressing, anxious moments in caring and compassionate ways. That is, if in faithful imitation of Christ we are to behave as if death were not, it is in those moments of encounter with those still encumbered by death and the victim-making processes that our secure attachment is most necessary. While our attachment orientations begin in infancy, they remain malleable throughout our lives. That is, quote, feelings of security can be augmented even among people who have an insecure orientation, end quote, see, good news. Those with positive secure attachment bases and those with less secure bases can employ certain techniques to strengthen and increase the security of their base, such that it becomes a greater resource to draw upon in caring for others. In the practice of attachment priming, one recalls a moment of care and security in which they felt worthy of love and compassion. Reconnecting to this experience results in a shift of one's attachment level toward a greater sense of greater security, and so better enables one to compassionately care for others. When these techniques are combined with intentional guided imagery, as in specific meditative or contemplative acts, studies consistently show that their effects are compounded. In these practices, one intentionally places oneself visually within the caring compassion of another in a safe and secure relationship with them, thereby building and strengthening their attachment in service of then more effectively showing caring compassion to others. Studies here, quote, suggest the possibility that repetition of attachment-based visualizations within contemplative practice could support the internalization of an unlimited secure base via meditation, end quote. While Condon and Mimetic in their research go on to outline such techniques available to anybody, they are, as they acknowledge, explicitly drawing on practices common to the Buddhist tradition and founded on what they term a relational starting point. In contrast to, quote, the hyper-individualistic framework of self-help so widely assumed in Western meditation programs today, end quote, these practices are rooted in what they call a deep relationality, one which places the practitioner amid a nexus of support, so that, quote, the power of care comes not only from one's own efforts, but also from beyond oneself, end quote. While this aspect of deep relationality sits at the very foundation of Buddhist practice, Condon and Mimetic draw specifically on the practices of going for refuge and of Buddhānusmrti. With the thrice repeated phrase, I go to the Buddha as refuge, I go to the Dharma as refuge. I go to the Sangha as refuge. The Buddhist names the awakened one, the Buddha, his body of teaching, the Dharma, and the community of those devoted to Buddhist wisdom and practice, the Sangha, as sources of safety from the stormy seas of the suffering world and as objects of their devoted practice. The refuges represent a declaration of trust and commitment as one turns away from certain actions and orientations and toward the actions and orientations of the awakened ones. Closely related are practices of Buddhānusmrti, those imagined exercises calling to mind so as to make present the Buddha and the other accomplished masters. Smriti, mindfulness, a calling to mind. Anu, again and again. Buddha, the Buddha. Bringing these to mind, then, the practitioner places oneself before them and before their perfectly embodied caring compassion. These devotional acts figure prominently in the 8th century Mahayana Buddhist work, the Bodhicharyavatara, a text dedicated to cultivating the awakened qualities of the Buddha within oneself. With the work's opening words, its author, Shantideva, names the Buddhas of all times and their teachings, all those striving to enact them, as his place of refuge. He then turns to a ritual of Buddhānusmrti, calling to mind those awakened and awakening beings who perfectly embody the caring compassion he is seeking to cultivate in himself. Here he engages imaginatively with a retinue of awakened beings, prostrating before them and extolling their awakened qualities manifested for the benefit of all others. In their presence, he confesses to being deluded and rejoicing in what he shouldn't have, to unspecified harms committed in, quote, body, speech, and mind, end quote, to cruel evil done in ways he did not understand. Remorseful and fearful, Shantideva searches in all directions for one who will deliver him from his harmful ignorance. Quote, what saint will deliver me from this great fear, he asks. The only answer he can utter, of course, is the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who have gone before him into awakening. Those, quote, who have taken the care of the world, the conquerors who remove all fear, end quote. It is in these in whom Shantideva places his trust, these to whom he goes for refuge, and these whose paths he will now seek to follow. In this practice, Mimetic writes, quote, Shantideva experiences himself as deeply seen and empowered by the enlightened beings to follow in their footsteps, end quote. Embodying the Buddha's compassion begins with receiving the Buddha's compassion. Concluding this opening rite, in imagery reticent of that often used for the Buddha, Shantideva then dedicates himself to others, writing, quote, I am medicine for the sick. May I be both doctor and their nurse until the sickness does not recur. May I become both food and drink in the eons of famine. I am protector of the unprotected and the caravan leader for travelers. I have become the boat, the causeway, and the bridge. May I be a light for those in need, a bed for those in need of rest, a servant for those in need of service, end quote. Through placing himself before those he seeks to emulate and receiving that compassionate care which he aims to express, Shantideva comes to see himself as one empowered to emulate the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in their compassionate care for others. It is these practices then that Condon and Mimetic have in mind when they observe, quote, relational meditations support the internalization of an unlimited secure base by recalling a moment of secure, caring connection in daily practice and then repeatedly re-inhabiting that experience in brief moments throughout the day, end quote. When this moment of secure, caring connection is one in which we experience the care and compassion of the one who perfectly cares for us, it can be a secure base indeed. Supposedly, Martin Luther affixed a note above his wash basin, reading, remember your baptism, instructing himself to recall that event and what it represented each time he washed. While historian Timothy Wengert tosses cold water on the historicity of this claim, right, don't let that one go by. It is certainly true that baptismal remembrance was a major theme of his and subsequent Lutheran theology. It was in moments of grievous doubt, when one's weakness regarding temptations towards sin came into view, that Luther commended the Christian to remember, writing in his large catechism, quote, "Thus we must regard baptism and put it to use in such a way that we may draw strength and comfort from it when our sins or conscience oppress us, and say, but I am baptized. And if I have been baptized, I have the promise that I shall be saved and have eternal life," end quote. For Luther, quote, "There is on earth no greater comfort than baptism, for through it we come under the judgment of grace and mercy," end quote. Note, though, that Luther does not intend a simple recollection of an event long past and its promise for a future life, but rather a transformation of the Christian not yet complete, but already begun. In his treatise on baptism, he writes, quote, "In baptism, God allies God's self with you and becomes one with you in a gracious covenant of comfort," end quote. Remember your baptism, then, means to recall the fact of the event, that it occurred, and also its meaning, God's ongoing accepting presence in your life. Contemporary Lutheran theologian Lisa Dahill writes that it is in this remembrance, quote, "our true identity is found, child of God, endlessly and personally beloved," end quote. Remembering one's baptism, then, calling to mind the event and its meaning, can be a potent example of an attachment priming event in which one experiences oneself worthy of divine love and care, and so strengthens and augments one's secure base. While Pastor Martin regularly emphasizes the comfort and assurance of the faith baptismal remembrance brings, he also has something more dramatic in mind for this alliance of Christ and the Christian. In his Babylonian captivity, he writes, quote, "It is therefore indeed correct to say that baptism is a washing away of sins, but the expression is too mild and weak. The sinner does not so much need to be washed as he needs to die in order to be wholly renewed and made another creature, and to be conformed to the death and resurrection of Christ, with whom he dies and rises again through baptism," end quote. While Luther often seems to be writing about the final death and resurrection and the symbolic worldly death and resurrection all at once, it is clear that throughout his baptismal writings, he intends baptismal remembrance to be a resource against the recurrence of sin, a strengthening of one's conscience in the face of guilt and despair, yes, but also of one's courage in the face of temptation. And yes, Luther is largely singing this song to its traditional tune, having in mind the original sin of Adam. But for those of us learning to sing this song in an Alisonian key, his words offer solace and hope for those moments when we are fearfully called upon to live as if death were not. By augmenting and strengthening our attachment base through regular practices of baptismal remembrance, we increase our abilities to respond fruitfully in those moments when we might be tempted to succumb to death's illusion. We have, after all, already died to the ways of rivalry and their false promises, died to the need to be victim makers, and so are free to stand at the foot of the cross, unafraid of the consequences. Thus, to remember your baptism is not merely to recall the fact of the event, but it is a calling to mind of what it signifies in the life of the Christian. It is the atonement one has experienced and yet is undergoing. And in light of Condon and McCranston, this remembrance takes on added significance. For in remembering one's baptism, one is doing even more than reminding oneself of its meaning. Rather, one is reenacting its effect, its declaration, and hearing again its promise, once again emerging from the water with the words echoing in their ears, "This is my child, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Remembering one's baptism, then, is to place oneself again and again in that upper room, in the presence of the loving scapegoat return, "Peace be with you," and to be shown once again that the workings of mimetic rivalry unto death are hollow. Remember your baptism, now and frequently, that we might all be strengthened to stand lovingly with those still enthralled by death, as if death were not.
Well, thank you very much to the three panelists. We'll now be moving over to the second portion of today's roundtable. First, James will give some insights and thoughts. And after that, we'll open the floor to any kind of participant, a question, comment, concern, emotional baggage, and so on. If you would like to participate, just raise your hand, and then Martine will have a mic and we'll pass it around so that people online could also hear you.
Shall I come in?
Of course. Whatever your heart desires.
Okay, thank you very much. Is this audible?
Yeah.
Good. First of all, I'd just like to say, it occurred to me as I was listening, how many of the bits of me, which you very kindly quoted, were first tried out in audiences which Carlos had established in Mexico City, in lectures at the Cook many years ago, when we were both young and pretty. In the Cook in Mexico City, and in the Divino Redentor in Paris. So it was just lovely to hear 20-something years later these memories coming back with you still here. So thank you very much for having made this possible. And thank you for wonderful opportunities to talk and discuss with so much. I'm sure that it's going to get extremely exciting, so I won't take up too much time. And I just wanted to start by saying how delighted I was to hear of how the phrase intelligence of the victim gives you a chance to give a whole lecture in epistemology to the students. What a great opportunity that must be which is wonderful. Because I learned from you what I meant at the time as well, because it is a phrase. Let me say that the phrase to me came with the sense of a military intelligence, a sapper, someone advancing through enemy territory, who is aware of the kind of obstacles and pitfalls that there may be, and particularly of the pitfalls that may be by acting victimally before time. In my mind, for instance, one of the examples of this is the temptation of Jesus. Cast yourself down from the temple, because it says his angels will bear you up on their wings. Psalm 121, I think. And the temptation, particularly as it's brought out in Luke, where everything is to do with time, is anticipate the atonement. Get it out of the way. Do it now. Jump down. And the whole point is that it needs to be in a place where the extraordinary dynamic of him being handed over and him handing himself over has to be identical. And it has to be done within the twin framework of the the sacrifice of the atonement and the Passover sacrifices, which was only, it was not frequently that the days fell on the same day, the atonement from the old calendar and the Passover on the new calendar. So a whole number of things being entered into incredibly carefully so as to be able to alter the sign of everything without being trapped by it. That's the sense that I thought originally, but I think that it is, because it's going with what you were talking about. It's, in a sense, it's a showing how to do this and making it possible for us, we hope, to likewise, to avoid precocious self-canonization, which at least for me is always the temptation, trying to get the brownie points now. And you say, no, brownie points at their appropriate time. We all want brownie points. Get them at the appropriate time. So that's, for me, that's the, which goes exactly, I think, with how you were. I think it's simply another metaphor for what you were saying. And then with Madeline, I loved your talking about joy. I'm so pleased. I think that is absolutely the central thing. My favorite verse of scripture, of all scripture, is for the joy that was set before him. He endured the cross, he called it nothing to shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. Hebrews, someone will tell me, 2? Or is it 12? I forget. Isn't it wonderful to be in a Catholic faculty?
A Bible scholar left.
Even our resident Lutheran has gone all Buddhist. But anyhow, Epistle to the Hebrews. Why I think that's very important. It's very important for the same reason that something that Brian was saying is terribly important. Because it suggests that the whole sense of forgiveness that comes with the Christian thing is secondary to the bringing about of this joy, which is the new creation. Forgiveness is the access to being created of this sort of animal, us. That's my definition of original sin. We are the animal for whom our access to creation is through forgiveness. And I think that it's precisely that it's got to be seen as not a reactive sort of forgiveness. On the contrary, grace abounds means that it's part of the creative process, which is so keen that we be opened up and able to enjoy things more, that our hearts have to be broken open. And the question, therefore, of what's the way in which we're enabled to have our hearts broken open so that we can participate in more and enjoy things more. But I think you're absolutely right. I think the joy is the central aim of that. And I'm so glad that you brought out the John 9 joy passages as well. It's clear that the longing for all this is participation in joy. Sin is our problem. The hamartiocentric universe is not yet understanding that. The whole point of this is joy. So I want to thank you. I think that was wonderful. And with Greg, as someone with a lack of secure attachment, I was without which another thing I'm sure if I had been a person of secure attachment, I wouldn't have written the nonsense that I have, or had to live the crazy lifestyle involved with it. I'm slightly suspicious of the therapeutic language that sounds as though it's putting right something that was wrong from early life, though I'm aware that that's the case. I have an adopted son who was abandoned thrice in his early life, and the damage is astronomical, and no way even a messiah-like figure like myself can be able to cure that. One of the true sources of learning of hopelessness is loving someone who's been so deeply and totally abandoned, knowing that there's no cure. There's no cure for this. The image which I use, which I think is saying the same, particularly when you were talking about baptism, the image which came to me while you were talking is, again, this is by chance, I'm clearly in a Lucan mood, and this is a Lucan phrase. It was, rejoice not that you do these things, rejoice rather that your names are written in heaven. The suggestion that the real attachment is not something which you have, it's something which has you and is producing your life here in such a way that you are enabled to live baptismally, as you were saying. And that's become increasingly important to me just psychologically as I stop worrying about whatever it is that Robert Frost said, that your parents fuck you up, worrying about that shit and starting to ask instead, who is it that is coming upon me to be? Is that part of the same thing? Is that imaginable the same?
Yes, I think so.
The same way.
One who comes to us and holds us, and
yes.
creates that attachment. It's not our
Not our
feeling attachment one.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for opening up that.
Thank you, James. Open, right?
Yeah, we'll open the floor to anyone, and just raise your hand, and then Martine will pass the mic around. I'll also do some mic passing, so whoever feels moved.
Well, the broadcast now.
It's following the last two conflicts. Your concluding comment reminded me of Pascal's unforgettable line, spoken in the voice of Jesus. You would not search for me had I not already found you.
Great. Thank you guys for 3 really wonderful papers and a helpful introduction and very exciting reflection from you, James. It seems like the theme of resurrection was something that was woven through all the papers. I don't know if that was intentional, but it was definitely helpful. And it's sort of being this way in which you're trying to frame mimetic theory's interaction with these particular questions of spirituality or of forgiveness. And I want to, I think, just reflect on the image of Christ's wounds, which remain at the resurrection, which I think is a helpful and important image that I didn't hear anyone of you speak about. So I want to offer it as like a question and a challenge, in the sense of like, maybe even in the terms of what James was responding to Greg, right? On the sense of like, there's something which lingers even in that process of resurrection, of changing attachments, that sort of thing. But one still has to learn to live with joy. And so I'm thinking especially, and I know, Brian, you kind of gestured towards guilt and community healing and stuff, and you all mentioned that this is hard, so I'm going to make it worse. But I want to know about how you are thinking about the usefulness of this approach to mimetic theory for spirituality, especially in terms of places where the roles of oppressor and oppressed are not so tidy, and especially in places where that harm has already happened. It seems like a lot of what was being talked about in the panel was about how to prevent rivalry or prevent reaction. But there are many cases, for example, in Eastern Europe, ecumenical spaces where, you know, the murder of Serbian Orthodox at the hands of Croatian Catholics, and then the reverse happening in Romania with the Iron Guard and the genocide of Jews and Catholics by Orthodox fascists. And so in those spaces where the harm has already happened, what is the place of spirituality or like theologians in work of transitional justice? I know none of you are experts in that, so I'm not trying to stump you. I'm just curious about what you, as people working with Jarrett, might say could be helpful for those of us who are.
I don't know that I have a very good answer for your question, or at least one part of your question, for what is the role of theologians in working with transitional justice or transformative justice in places like that. I have an answer or a response to that would include probably what is informing the question. But the one thing that I would go to right away is the importance of the image of the risen Christ with wounds. And I'm thinking immediately of an important part of what James does in a number of pieces, but early on in his work, I think the Knowing Jesus book, for one, the small book that, when was that published? In 92. And then that was unfolded, I believe, in large part in The Joy of Being Wrong, right? And so there is, I think, probably one of the more powerful theological reflections I've ever come across on this particular issue are in those texts, both of them. And you know, James, I would love, of course, for you to correct or expand on what it is I'm about to say, but it is very important that that image of the risen Christ, not without wounds, be there, because it is the communication, of course, it's the showing forth of that body which in fact had been wounded. And so it's not as though resurrection amounts to, let's say, the liquidation of the history and all of the circumstances that led to the brutal death of Christ. But that rather that these are, without being preserved or eternalized in some sort of cult of suffering, theological eternalization of suffering, they are in fact redeemed and transformed, but not forgotten, as part of the ongoing shift on the part of those who receive that image to see what it is that we were or are still caught up in or implicated in. So the image, the primary affect is one of forgiveness, of course, of joy, but what it is that we are being freed from. And so there would be no point in the communication of that if that was not part of what is retained. I think there's probably also some analog with that in terms of our, humanities and creation's wounds, which is to say that the resurrection of the body and the resurrection of the dead and the transformation of all things, when God will be all in all, is not somehow a matter of massive amnesia, as though the whole drama of creation, including its travail, has been forgotten and liquidated, but rather is affirmed and transformed and is part of the expression of God's eternal love for creation, having undergone it in Christ with us. And that makes a huge difference in how we think of the end of all things. I think it also makes a huge difference in terms of how we ought to be prepared to be present with for ourselves or with others in their wounds as well. That it should not be some sort of expeditious effort to try to get beyond them, but to be with them without necessarily agitating those wounds, but to be with them, to tarry with them, yet knowing that they have an eschatological future. I think that really does change how we would be in the presence. Anyway, that's my initial. Go on.
Thank you for the question. I think that to speak of the role, maybe not of the theologian, but of the pastor, the Christian, to speak of our role as sibling, those of whom you're asking, is to speak of accompaniment, of a sticking witness. One of the things that James writes about forgiveness is that it is precisely not a cutting off from or an elevating oneself above or away from, but a commitment to that person. That forgiveness is what binds us to one another as those who know the need for forgiveness, as those who know the wounds of the body of Christ in ourselves and also our capacity to create forgiveness. So I think that I've been chewing over something on this question because it's come up a number of times for those of us who were part of the preparation for this. I've been chewing over something John Edwards said in our conversation. He said, it's in James's writing, drawing on Gerard, all of these beautiful, lovely images that he says and describes about forgiveness and the community, they're never the end of a logical syllogism. They're never an object of teaching, which if I could just put it on the right chart with the right graph in just the right way, then you would get. They're always the fruit of an experience for oneself. And they can only ever come downstream from that experience. It can't be handed to somebody. It has to be undergone. And only then is there any capacity or ability to act in that way that is haltingly, slowly, only sometimes, still never complete until the end, free of all of that. So something about accompaniment, patience, journey.
I don't know that I have too much to add, but thank you for your question, Sarah. I think, just briefly, one of the things that I find so compelling about joy is that it can exist in situations of grave suffering. And I think that the resurrected body of Christ speaks to that, obviously in a different valence, but I do think that it speaks to the possibility that joy can arise in situations of darkness. I know that's just very simple, but more to say on that. Thank you.
I actually want to follow with that thread of thought on joy, if you would permit me. I'm just thinking about what causes joy, or how do you actually provide a space for the cultivation of and the flowering of joy? And just one thing that I was thinking during your presentation was joy seems to be a gift of the Spirit. It seems to be a fruit of the Spirit. And it seems to me that in order to experience it or encounter it, you have to have a particular grace to move into it and be receptive to it in the first place, right? So one of your concerns you raised in your paper was, there are those who have been traumatized to such a point that they're not in that space to receive the gift of joy. And if joy is the answer to sort of reforming our identity, I'm curious about your thoughts on what do you do? What comes first? Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to be very cautious. I don't want to present joy as the answer. I think that could be dangerous, and I recognize the reasons why. I want to just offer it as one piece of it. That being said, I do wonder about the possibility of like a cultivation of some kind of practice of joy and what that could look like. In one of I don't remember the author now, but in the edited volume edited by Metz about joy, one of the authors was talking about like permission as a really important facet of our ability to feel and express joy, and actually feel and express grief and sorrow. And that permission to feel is closely related to a person's engagement with those two poles of human experience. I don't actually think they're like poles, but very closely related probably. So I do think that we have an issue in our culture about like the permission to express joy, experience joy, making time for joy. And that's closely related to our struggle with the expression of grief and the expression of sorrow. So that's one piece of it. I think that another piece of it that I've been thinking about is the cultivation of a practice of attention, a la Simone Weil, or even someone like Eddie Hillesum, who, knowing or presuming correctly that her death was imminent in the concentration camps, she was still able to write of her experiences of deep mystical joy, like staring down the barrel of death, basically. And I think that there was something really striking about that. I don't know that I have satisfying answers as to what that means, but I suspect that joy is related to attention, but also like a sense of time that's grounded in something that's more powerful than death, which is like, yeah. It's a question that I want to continue to explore, but those are like my instincts as to where it might go. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all three of these. I thought they're all excellent and really illuminating. So a question I have, and this kind of gets to maybe the crux or the core of one of the questions I still have about Mimetic theory, and hopefully I'll be able to come up with an answer in my presentation tomorrow. So that's why that's a good question. But always the pause. No, I think it gets to this kind of, I think, one of the core questions that you're raising, Brian, about sort of theological anthropology, and Maddie, yours as well. For Gerard, it's impossible to sort of, well, he wants to blur the lines between victim and victimized, right? He wants to kind of like develop this robust sense of what it means to be human that kind of is more expansive than either of these sort of identities, or any one particular identity for that matter. But in those kind of moments of like very real kind of oppression, grinding sort of oppression that like, makes it almost impossible to sort of get to that sense of joy that you're talking about, Maddie. How do we make sure that when we're using sort of a Girardian anthropology that we're not moving too quickly, sort of like blur those lines? Does that make sense? Like another way of thinking about it, I think about like Stillbeck's is like negative contrast experience, right? Like that sort of affirmation, this should not be, like that sort of deep sense of like, this is wrong. So I'm being wrong, right? So how do we maintain space for that sort of affirmation without too quickly saying, well, yes, but also, does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think, well, for one thing, it is true that Girard and mimetic theory more generally is very resistant to an understanding of human persons and any one person as not always already in relationship with others. And that means, therefore, a complicated identity, and it's dynamic. And so the notion of an identity that is, a container with certain kinds of things in it that is buffered from things that are outside of it is just simply a fiction. So we have to see that we are bound up with one another. And that can, of course, be something where we share positive qualities, we share the negative qualities, or some mixture thereof. I don't think, though, that means sloppiness of thinking in a kind of almost amoral view that is incapable of identifying certain persons or groups as profoundly grieved and therefore in need of justice and being helped, addressed, heard, and all of that. In other words, there's nothing about the so-called interindividuality, anthropological sort of insight of mimetic theory that would render the need for having clarity with respect to justice impossible. And as a matter of fact, I mean, the whole notion of the scapegoat mechanism and its injustice suggests this very point. That is, to scapegoat a person or persons is an act of injustice. And it may even well be that the person or persons who are being scapegoated as a sort of an expedient cause of unanimity by the scapegoating group may be guilty of something. It's not as though the scapegoated is pure in any sort of way. It's just that the very mechanism of achieving some kind of in-group unanimity at the expense of another, that is what is unjust, aside from how we would morally evaluate the responsibility of the so-called scapegoat. So anyway, we have to be able to, I suppose, walk and chew gum at the same time with these things to recognize that it is a relational anthropology, and this will lead to some pretty complicated questions when it comes to grief. I mean, we know that those persons or groups who have in fact been met with injustice and have been ostracized, but have been victimized in brutal ways. I mean, part of the injustice is that it also instills almost seemingly instinctively the desire for revenge or projection or sort of replicating it in other ways because we're so highly mimetic. It's almost despite ourselves we can sort of perpetuate these things. And so that, I think, is the dynamic that has to be also attended to without that leading to some sort of additional moral judgment against those who are victims. Anyway, in short, it's complicated, but I do think that we have to be able to think discerningly about these things. And I don't think that mimetic theory is at all an obstacle to that, but can actually help us with that. James, I think wants to say something.
If I can say something in relation both to that and to your point, I think that Girard's notion of the scandalon is absolutely central here, because it's one of his more difficult notions to catch, I think. It's the sense of being locked into a repetitive rivalry with your model who becomes your obstacle, such that you can't let go of each other. And of course, it's one of the most evil things that an evil power oppressor does, is not only does you harm, but ties you into needing to get back at them. In other words, they then run your head. And that is the most evil. And so much of the space of accompaniment, I think, is actually enabling people to be set free from having the bastards occupy their heads with free rein. And that's so complicated, because one's first instinct is, if I give up my hatred for this person, who will I be? Because who I have become has become entirely dependent on the evil that was done to me. And it's a poor identity, but at least it's an identity. So how the hell, who am I going to be if I let go of that? As you can imagine, therefore, how complicated. But I think that what you were talking about, it's where we hope we find people who recognize harm and call it as such, but also don't want to see those we love forever conditioned, forever run by that. So help them to have the courage to step out of the identity. No, but if I let go of that, does that make sense? Sorry.
But you're going to answer all of that for us tomorrow. Okay, that's great.
Not accustomed to this kind of thing. Yeah.
I guess so.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, one and all, for this conversation. I'm asking a question that arises out of teaching some of these questions and some of James's work. The essay that I know Brian teaches a lot, Love of Neighbor Within Its Divided Self. I think Greg probably too. And I'm mindful of Greg's comment too, that the way this is communicated is by an experience, by undergoing something. We also read a decent amount of Thich Nhat Hanh. I think Greg does that too, inherited from John McCransky. And students find this profoundly, not just counterintuitive, but morally offensive, disturbing, that this kind of forgiveness should be not just an exhortation, but like kind of central to the Christian thing. Steve and I were talking about this a few days ago. Sometimes it's more palatable when it's put in terms of sort of like a therapeutic intervention on behalf of the person who's been wronged. And I think this is like a thin way of understanding what you're saying about not giving the bastards free rent in your head, or in a more fulsome sense, like that the only way I can be released is by being released together with willing the release of everyone else. That the kind of thing that has to happen to me is as sort of drastic as that, not just willing to be released from the anguish that comes from the desire for revenge, but truly understanding my release as part of the release of everyone else. So I'm just wondering if anyone, Jane, anyone here who teaches this material and thinks about it, how does this communicate? I mean, in some sense, one is trying to provoke an experience in the context of the class and sort of activating experiences students have had, but it's not systematizable. But what works? How do you do this as teachers?
When I paired Allison and Thich Nhat Hanh, or when I've introduced Allison, when I'm discussing Christianity and Thich Nhat Hanh, when I'm discussing Buddhism, I always bring in the figure of the Bodhisattva and I suppose, the embodiment of that and non-biased compassion. So it's sort of a link that has to be made for the students between the non-biased compassion of the Bodhisattva figure and the agape, like love of Christ, in order to make that leap without it being like purely a therapeutic construct for them. That's one way.
Thank you all so much for this very rich.
Matthew's question? We can come back.
Yeah, we can come back. I need to think.
Well, I just want to say a couple of things about it. First, is that, building off of Matt's question earlier, and Ryan's answer to that, is that one of the things to stress is that the detached generosity of God that Gerard terms it is never a lack of discernment. Right? It's never the lack of an ability to call a thing, to stand with those who are hurting in their presence and with them. What it is the desire to and the halting ability to, we're building, working toward, not reducing the other based on that, on actions of victim. It's what our grandmothers told us about loving the sinner and hating the sin. On one hand, and I forget what I was going to say. On the other hand, oh, that's what it was. The other thing that I think is important to keep in these conversations is that it is offensive. It is too much. It is overwhelming. He wound up on a cross, and so many others since it. And we oppose these stories and their actions as if death were not, knowing that we too might. It is offensive, but then we keep in mind the question of offensive to what and why. And how do we contrast that with something else?
John Edwards, want to add something?
Yeah, go ahead. No, actually, I've spoken.
And then
go ahead,
perhaps after John, the last question, and then kind of just close.
Good, thank you.
I don't know if I have an answer, but what I've tried to do in some more in a ministry setting and in classroom setting, which might not work exactly the same way, but is trying to get students to see that those who have perpetrated some forms of harm against them, mostly in a small scale way, I'm not trying to uncover, deep harms, because that's not, it's for students to choose to disclose, not for me to kind of invoke or, but to move them to see that those that have done those harms, can they start to see that those people are themselves caught in a system that they didn't produce, right? Are there ways that they can have insights to say, yeah, my father did this, my mother did this, and again, I'm not trying to, open trauma in the space unless the students are already there and bringing it. But so I try to stay on a small level. But can you see what is it that brought this perpetrator of some to this act? Did they freely choose this? I mean, in some sense, yes, but but can you see them as part of this system that they didn't create and that somehow has harmed them first? And so just trying to make small, again, not to erase the harm that they've experienced themselves, but to make that connection of this entrapment. And I think what Gerard does and what James does well is use the figure of Satan in this way, right? To see that Satan is not a, I mean, this is not, I wouldn't try to do with students to say, but it's not a figure out there that is out to get us, but is the system of possession that is prior to us that we can't help but find ourselves entangled in. And if you start to see small ways that that's happened for even those that we, have resentment toward or have been harmed by, it makes it a little bit less horrific to introduce the notion of forgiveness as something, or as a practice, as something that is essential for our own humanity.
Question. Final comment.
Well, thank you again. This has been such a poignant discussion for me. I think it's rare that an academic panel lecture produces such strong emotions. I love when theology actually has experiential value or has value on one's own life. And so thank you so much for opening up this discussion. Matt's question and James's response provoked a question for me about whether or not mimetic theory has anything to say about the non-human other. James, you were saying that the experience of enmity can produce a sort of mutual reinforcing sense of identity, that your enemy is the one that gives you a sense of identity. And I'm wondering if a kind of non-human enemy, a kind of crusade against a disease or a crusade against some sort of social injustice can produce the same type of negative spiral that can cause harm to the human in that pair. I think about in the movie How to Survive a Plague, which sort of follows the ACT UP movement. There's an activist whose name I can't remember right now, but he spent his the 80s and 90s fighting against AIDS, fighting for government sort of intervention, and that anger fueled him and gave him a sense of purpose. And then I believe when AZT was developed and the battle was won, the war was won, he fell into this deep depression and actually became addicted to meth and sort of spiraled downward because the fight, the sort of vengeful attitude towards this non-human other, and I guess there were humans involved in government officials, that sort of thing. But once the fight was won, then he lost his sense of identity. So my question is, does mimetic theory have anything to say about that kind of dynamic? Is the vengeful impulse against even non-humans something to be avoided? Is hating the sin just as bad as hating the sin?
James, I was thinking about, well, first, things related to animal sacrifice for one. It's a big part, but also the role that natural disasters and plagues and things take in various kinds of persecution texts, and the causal relationship or the multipolar causal relationship between environmental disaster, but also the human. Anyway, these are some thoughts that I have. It is pretty rife throughout mimetic theory.
To be honest, I find it very difficult to imagine a fight that is purely with a non-human other, because in fact it is always with relation. You know, the war on drugs was a war against all black populations. The war on this, the war on COVID turned out to be an enormously complicated psychodrama. But so psychodrama within the country, with a significant number of people, frankly, going to an early unnecessary deaths because of their loyalty to complete fake nonsense. I think it's always how we run each other. I think that our ability to turn particular objects into tokens within is endless. And the difficulty is having enough peace to be able to see the object in front of us and learn what it is when it's another. I think something similar with the Middle Eastern thing. Lots of commentators have pointed out that Netanyahu and Hamas needed each other and used each other. And there was a certain stasis for a long time until this particular outrage then blew the whole thing apart. And now nobody knows what to do because all that is over. But I think that the image which I have of that is the prophet Jonah. Jonah basically got pissed. He was the equivalent of your friend falling into the meth. God forgave them. And he had always known that God was going to forgive them. So he got really angry. And I think that that's a real temptation for all of us, those of us who find ourselves close to victory on something is always going to be close to depression because, okay, who am I going to be now? Now that I'm no longer important because that thing's no longer important. I think that's hugely. Sorry.
Yeah, I think so. Carlos is signaling us for a quick final word for each, and I guess I would just simply express my gratitude for this. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I don't know. When you sign up for academic life, I'm just following up. When you sign up for academic life, this is the sort of thing that you hope happens pretty regularly, and you find out that it's a lot of executive committee meetings. But I also think that what's really wonderful about this is the fact that James, your work expressed Wednesday, how impactful it's been on me, and certainly how it's been on others. And it's a joy to be able to share that with others. But it's been part of some aspects of mimetic theory have been part of our scholarly work, but also our pedagogical activity. And that has really made a difference, and I think, in how some of us really approach this material. And so it's nice to have a combination of that, the scholarly questions, but also just the pedagogical implications of that. We are sitting in the classroom to have that. So it's a lot of worlds nicely converging. Appreciate it.
I don't have any final word, but thank you. And I'm excited to continue the conversation tomorrow.
Yeah, likewise, echoing one thing that Brian said is that one of the things that I've been so thankful for in your work, James, and distance Gerard, is being able to show myself first, within students in the classroom, a version of Christianity that resonates so powerfully, or makes sense in ways so powerfully. You said on Wednesday that so many people who are looking at the church and looking at the way that many of our churches have treated queer identifying people and saying that's not what Christianity is, in the way that so many of us inside the church have not seen or have taken so long to see. They are, in a sense, seeing something so much more clearer than we are, and it's so helpful for them to be able to put kind of a framework to what they know to do all that. But
if we could give a hand one more time to our panelists in the room. And just a quick overview for tomorrow. Everything will be directly below us in Stoke South 195. At 9 o'clock.
The advertising here.
Yeah, at 9 o'clock, as our own Zach Chernovich will be leading a roundtable on race and
Zach,
anthropology.
there. Yeah.
And then James will give a keynote address at 12 after a lunch.
Second one, yeah.
Yeah, and then our own Carlos Mendoza will be leading a roundtable on political theology at 2.
With Matt Matikoff and then Joe Cesar on Zoom. Right.
And then there will be a SOFO 4 to 5, and then goodbye. So yeah, thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thanks to the moderator.
Oh, yes.